They found the photographs in a trunk that hadn't been opened since 1889, buried beneath 3 generations of forgotten family possessions in the attic of a Baltimore row house scheduled for demolition. There were hundreds of them, cabinet cards, tintypes, daguerreotypes, all featuring the same woman. She appeared at lectures, surrounded by crowds. She stood on stages before packed audiences. She was photographed with Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln. In image after image she was centered, prominent, clearly the focus of attention and admiration. Her name appeared on the backs of dozens of photographs. Dr. Sarah Mapps Douglass, Philadelphia, 1856. Miss Sarah Mapps Douglass, addressing the Anti-Slavery Convention, 1838. Dr. Douglass with students, Institute for Colored Youth, 1865. The construction foreman who discovered the trunk did what anyone in 2019 would do. He Googled her name. Nothing. He searched historical databases, genealogy sites, academic records, a few scattered references in footnotes, a handful of mentions in obscure journals, but nothing substantial. Nothing that explained why a woman who appeared in photographs with the most famous abolitionists and civil rights leaders in American history, who was clearly educated and influential and beloved, had been almost completely erased from historical memory. The trunk also contained letters, thousands of them, written to her and by her, preserved in careful chronological order. They revealed a story so extraordinary that historians who later examined them initially believed they were forgeries, that no one person could have accomplished so much, influenced so many, and then been so thoroughly forgotten. But the letters were real, the photographs were real, and Sarah Mapps Douglass was real. This is the story of how a woman who was loved by many, who changed the course of American history, who pioneered education and medicine and civil rights, disappeared from the record almost completely. And this is the story of why she was erased, and why her erasure tells us something crucial about whose stories get remembered and whose get buried. The weight of being remarkable. Sarah Mapps Douglass was born free in Philadelphia on September 9, 1806, into a world that didn't know what to do with her. She was black in an America that was still decades away from abolishing slavery, female in a society that didn't believe women should be educated, and brilliant in a way that made everyone uncomfortable because her existence challenged every assumption about what was supposed to be possible for someone like her. Her parents, Robert Douglass and Grace Bustle, were both from prominent free black families in Philadelphia, part of a small but influential community of African Americans who'd been free for generations, and had built lives of relative stability and prosperity despite the suffocating restrictions of racial prejudice. Her grandfather, Cyrus Bustle, had been a baker who'd supplied bread to George Washington's troops during the Revolutionary War. Her family wasn't wealthy by white standards, but they were educated, politically active, and deeply committed to the cause of abolition and racial justice. Sarah was raised in an environment where education was treated as both a privilege and a weapon, a tool for dismantling the racist arguments that insisted black people were intellectually inferior. Her mother taught her to read before she was 4. By 7, she was studying Latin. By 10, she was reading medical texts because her father believed that knowledge of healing would make her valuable in ways that prejudice couldn't diminish. But it was what happened when Sarah was 12 that would shape the trajectory of her entire life and plant the seeds of her eventual erasure from history. In 1818, Philadelphia's Quaker community established a school for black children, and Sarah was among the first students enrolled. The teacher was a young white Quaker woman named Margaretta Fortin, who saw something extraordinary in Sarah, not just intelligence but a hunger for knowledge that seemed almost desperate, as if she understood that education was the only way to make herself undeniable in a world that wanted to pretend she didn't exist. Margaretta began giving Sarah additional lessons after school, teaching her subjects that weren't part of the regular curriculum: natural philosophy, chemistry, higher mathematics, classical literature. She lent Sarah books from her own library, encouraged her to write essays and poetry, treated her not as a student from an inferior race who needed charitable instruction, but as an intellectual equal whose mind deserved to be challenged and developed. It was revolutionary, and it was dangerous. By 1820, white parents in Philadelphia were complaining that too much education was being wasted on black children. that teaching them advanced subjects would only make them dissatisfied with their station in life. There was pressure on the Quaker community to limit the school's curriculum to basic literacy and vocational training. Enough education to make black children useful laborers, but not enough to make them think they deserved equality. Margaretta Fortin was fired in 1821 for refusing to dumb down her teaching. The school was restructured with new instructors who had more appropriate expectations for their students. Sarah, at 15, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. If the existing educational institutions wouldn't provide the education that black children deserved, she would create her own. In 1821, with her mother's support and using their family's modest savings, Sarah opened a school in her parents' home. She was 15 years old, teaching children who were sometimes only a few years younger than herself. She had no formal teaching credentials, no institutional backing, no guarantee that anyone would send their children to be educated by a teenage girl, but families came. They came because Sarah's reputation for intelligence had spread through Philadelphia's black community, because her family was respected, because there were so few options for black children who wanted real education, rather than just the basics that white institutions deemed appropriate. Sarah taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, natural science. She used the same curriculum that white schools used for their advanced students, refusing to accept that black children deserved anything less rigorous. She taught in the morning and studied in the afternoon, reading every book she could borrow or afford, teaching herself medicine and botany and chemistry because she believed that knowledge was power and that the more she knew, the harder it would be for the world to dismiss her. By the time she was 18, Sarah's school had grown from a handful of students in her parents' parlor to 30 children in a rented building. By 20, she had 50 students and had hired 2 assistant teachers. By 25, her school was recognized as one of the best educational institutions for black children in the entire country. She should have been famous. She should have been celebrated. But here's what happened instead. Every time Sarah's school was mentioned in newspapers or educational journals, her race was emphasized in ways that diminished her accomplishment. She wasn't described as an excellent educator, but as a colored woman who, despite the limitations of her race, has managed to establish a creditable school. She wasn't praised for her teaching methods, but for being a credit to her people, as if her success was surprising rather than earned. And increasingly, as her reputation grew, the credit for her work began to be assigned to others. When educational reformers visited Philadelphia and wrote about innovative teaching methods being used in schools for black children, they attributed the techniques to white administrators who oversaw black schools, rather than to Sarah, who developed them. When the Pennsylvania Abolition Society published reports about educational progress among African Americans, they mentioned institutions but rarely named black educators, instead crediting white benefactors and supporters. Sarah noticed this pattern, documented it in her letters with a mix of frustration and weary acceptance. In a letter to her friend Grace Douglas, no relation to Frederick Douglass, though they would later become friends, written in 1832, she wrote, "I have given 26 years of my life to the education of our people, have developed teaching methods that white educators now copy without attribution, have trained students who have gone on to become teachers and leaders themselves. Yet when the histories of Philadelphia education are written, my name appears in footnotes if it appears at all, while white men who merely donated money to the cause are hailed as pioneers and visionaries. I am learning that for a black woman, no accomplishment is remarkable enough to outweigh the disadvantage of existing while being both African and female. We are allowed to be exceptional, but only if we don't expect to be remembered for it." But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't stop, because she understood something fundamental. Her erasure from public recognition didn't diminish the real impact she was having on actual lives. Every child she taught, every student who learned to read and think critically and understand their own worth, that was real, regardless of whether historians acknowledged it. In 1833, Sarah became involved with the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, one of the first interracial women's organizations dedicated to abolition. This is where she met the women who would become her closest friends and allies: Lucretia Mott, the Quaker minister and women's rights advocate; Sarah Pugh, an abolitionist teacher; and Margaretta Fortin, her former teacher who'd been fired for treating black students as intellectual equals. These women recognized Sarah's brilliance, valued her opinions, fought alongside her, and they documented their work together in letters and meeting minutes and organizational records that should have preserved Sarah's role in the abolitionist movement for posterity. But here's what happened to those records. When historians later wrote about the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, they focused almost exclusively on the white members. Lucretia Mott became famous, her contributions celebrated and studied. Sarah Pugh was remembered and honored. But Sarah Mapps Douglas, who'd been equally active and equally influential, was reduced to occasional mentions, her contributions minimized or attributed to collective action rather than to her individual leadership. Why? Because the narrative of abolition that America wanted to tell was one where white people were the heroes who'd magnanimously freed the enslaved, not one where black people had fought for their own liberation, and where black women had been intellectual leaders and strategic thinkers. Sarah's erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic. In 1837, Sarah did something extraordinary. She began studying medicine. This was radical, not just because medical education was almost entirely closed to women of any race, but because the few women who did manage to access medical training were uniformly white and from wealthy families. Sarah had neither of those advantages, but she had determination and she had connections. She'd become friends with a white physician named Dr. James Rush, who'd been impressed by her knowledge of anatomy and physiology, knowledge she'd gained through independent study because formal education wasn't available to her. Dr. Rush began allowing Sarah to observe his practice, to read his medical texts, to ask questions and learn. It wasn't formal medical school, but it was closer than any black woman had gotten before. Sarah studied for years, learning everything she could about medicine and healing. She began treating patients in Philadelphia's black community, providing medical care to people who couldn't access white doctors or couldn't afford them. She specialized in women's health and children's diseases, areas that male doctors often dismissed as unimportant. By 1840, Sarah was functioning as a physician in everything but name. She diagnosed illnesses, prescribed treatments, performed minor surgical procedures. She saved lives. She built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the health of the community's most vulnerable members. And yet, she couldn't call herself a doctor. Medical licensing boards wouldn't certify a black woman. Medical schools wouldn't admit her. So she practiced medicine without the credentials, did the work without the recognition, saved lives without the title. But people in her community called her Dr. Douglas anyway, recognizing her expertise even if official institutions wouldn't. For years, that was enough for Sarah, knowing that she was doing the work, that she was helping people, that her knowledge was making a difference regardless of what name appeared on official records. Then, in 1842, something happened that would change Sarah's life and further complicate her historical legacy. She fell in love. His name was William Douglas, still no relation to Frederick, though the shared surname would later cause biographical confusion. He was a minister, an abolitionist, an educated man who'd also been born free and who understood the peculiar burden of being both exceptional and black in America. He courted Sarah with poetry and philosophical discussions, treated her intellect with the same appreciation he showed for her character. They married in 1843, and Sarah became Sarah Mapps Douglas. This is where her erasure becomes even more pronounced in historical records, because many of the documents that mention her after her marriage refer to her only as Mrs. William Douglas or the wife of Reverend Douglas, as if marriage had absorbed her identity entirely. Historians searching for Sarah Mapps Douglas often miss documents from the later period of her life because they're filed under her married name, with no indication that this Mrs. Douglas was the same person who'd been a pioneering educator and medical practitioner. It's a perfect example of how the historical record was structured to erase women's individual accomplishments, reducing them to appendages of their husbands. But Sarah didn't stop working after marriage. If anything, she intensified her efforts. In 1853, she became the head of the girls' preparatory department at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious educational institutions for black students in America. She designed the curriculum, trained the teachers, developed pedagogical methods that were revolutionary for their time. She believed that black girls deserved the same rigorous education as white boys, that they should Die not just basic academics but also science, mathematics, literature, art, music, everything that would allow them to become fully developed human beings rather than just useful laborers. The Institute for Colored Youth became famous. It was held up as an example of what black education could achieve. Visitors came from across the country and from Europe to observe its teaching methods, and yet, in most historical accounts of the Institute, Sarah's role is barely mentioned. The credit goes to the Institute's male administrators, to its white Quaker board members, to anyone except the black woman who actually designed and implemented the curriculum that made it successful. Sarah documented this pattern in her letters with a mix of sadness and defiance. In 1856, she wrote to Frederick Douglass, the famous one, with whom she'd become friends through their mutual work in abolition. I have spent 35 years building institutions that others now claim as their accomplishments. I have developed teaching methods that white educators copy without acknowledgement. I have trained hundreds of students who will carry forward the work of racial uplift, yet my name is being erased from the story even as I live it. I used to believe that excellence would be its own vindication, that work so good it couldn't be denied would eventually force recognition. I was naive. Excellence from a black woman is either attributed to someone else or dismissed as an anomaly. We are allowed to be exceptional, but only if we accept that our exceptionalism will be forgotten. But here's the remarkable thing about Sarah. Even knowing that her work would likely be erased, she kept working. She kept teaching, kept healing, kept writing, kept organizing, kept pushing for justice and equality. Because the work mattered more than the recognition. The lives she touched mattered more than whether her name appeared in history books. She treated Frederick Douglass's daughter when she fell ill. She taught the children of escaped slaves who'd made their way north on the Underground Railroad. She corresponded with Harriet Tubman about education for formerly enslaved people. She advised Susan B. Anthony on how to make the women's suffrage movement more inclusive of black women. All of this is documented in letters, in meeting minutes, in scattered references in other people's papers. But Sarah herself, her thoughts, her experiences, her voice, was being systematically edited out of the historical record even as she lived. Chapter 2, The Mechanics of Erasure. The Civil War should have been Sarah's moment of historical visibility. She was 60 when it started, had spent her entire life working toward the abolition of slavery and the advancement of her people. This was the moment when everything she'd fought for was finally being recognized as a national priority, when the cause she'd dedicated her life to was being validated through federal action. Sarah threw herself into war work with the same intensity she'd brought to everything else. She organized relief efforts for escaped slaves who'd fled to Philadelphia, established schools for their children, provided medical care for the sick and injured. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helped design educational programs for formerly enslaved people, trained teachers who would go south after the war to establish schools in the former Confederacy. She was in her 60s, should have been slowing down, but instead she was working harder than ever because she understood that this was a pivotal moment. The decisions made now would shape the future for generations of black Americans. She had to be part of it, had to use her knowledge and experience to help build a better future. The photographs from this period show a woman transformed by age but not diminished. White hair pulled back severely, eyes still sharp and intelligent, posture erect despite decades of work. She appears in group photographs with Frederick Douglass, with Sojourner Truth, with the leaders of the abolitionist movement who were now shaping Reconstruction policy. She should have been remembered as one of the architects of post-war black education. She should have been celebrated as a pioneer. Instead, this is when her erasure became most complete. Here's what happened. As the war ended and Reconstruction began, white America started telling itself a story about abolition that erased black agency almost entirely. The narrative became one where white abolitionists, Lincoln, the radical Republicans, white anti-slavery activists, had freed the slaves through their moral courage and political will. Black people were recast as passive recipients of freedom rather than active participants in their own liberation. This narrative required erasing people like Sarah Mapps Douglass because her existence complicated the story. She'd been fighting for freedom and equality since before many white abolitionists were even born. She'd built institutions, educated children, provided medical care, organized resistance. She'd been a leader not a victim waiting to be saved. So her contributions were minimized. Her leadership was reattributed to white colleagues who'd worked alongside her. Her innovations in education were credited to institutions rather than to her individual genius. Her medical practice was forgotten entirely because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that a black woman had been practicing medicine before most white women were even allowed to attend medical school. The Freedmen's Bureau records that should have documented Sarah's work were incomplete and poorly maintained. When they did mention her, it was often as a colored teacher or a local woman who assisted, never with the detail and recognition given to white workers doing the same work. Post-war histories of abolition began to be published in the 1870s and 1880s, and Sarah watched as her name disappeared from them. Books that she'd helped research, movements she'd helped lead, organizations she'd co-founded, all were described without mentioning her role. White abolitionists she'd worked with were lionized while she was reduced to a footnote if she was mentioned at all. In 1871, Sarah wrote to her friend William Still, the black historian and Underground Railroad conductor who was documenting the history of the anti-slavery movement. "I am watching myself be erased from history in real time, William. I read these new books about abolition and see my work attributed to others. See white men given credit for ideas I developed. See institutions I built described as if they sprang into existence without human effort or leadership. I am becoming a ghost while still alive, present in the photographs, visible in the records, for those who care to look, but invisible in the stories people tell about this era. I used to think that truth would prevail, that the historical record would eventually acknowledge reality. Now I understand that history is not a record of what happened, but a story about what we wish had happened. And America does not wish to acknowledge that a black woman was instrumental in shaping the moral and educational landscape of this nation." But William Still did acknowledge her. His book, The Underground Railroad, published in 1872, included detailed accounts of Sarah's work and contributions. It should have secured her place in history, should have made her impossible to ignore. Instead, Still's book itself was marginalized. It was published by a small press, reviewed dismissively by white critics who suggested that black authors couldn't be objective about their own history, and gradually faded from mainstream historical consciousness. It would take more than a century for historians to rediscover it and recognize its value. Sarah continued working into her 70s, even as her health declined. She kept teaching, kept treating patients, kept writing letters to younger activists encouraging them to continue the fight for equality and justice. She understood that she wouldn't live to see the full fruits of her labor, that she probably wouldn't be remembered for her contributions, but she worked anyway because the work itself was the point. In 1877, Sarah developed a respiratory illness that weakened her significantly. She was forced to retire from teaching, though she continued to tutor private students and see medical patients when she was strong enough. Her letters from this period are heartbreaking in their clarity about what was being lost, not just her own life, but the memory of what she'd accomplished. "I am 71 years old and dying slowly. I have educated thousands of children, many of whom have gone on to become teachers themselves, spreading knowledge like seeds that will grow long after I'm gone. I have practiced medicine for nearly 40 years, have brought children safely into this world, and have eased the dying out of it with dignity. I have fought for abolition and women's rights and educational equality. I have lived a life that mattered, that made a difference, that changed the trajectory of history in small but significant ways. And yet when I die, I know that my obituary, if I receive one at all, will describe me as the wife of the late Reverend William Douglas, and perhaps mention that I taught school for some years. Everything else will be forgotten, erased, treated as if it never happened. This is what it means to be a black woman in America, to build the foundation and watch others build monuments on top of it without acknowledging that the foundation exists." Sarah Mapps Douglas died on September 8, 1882, one day before her 76th birthday. Her obituary in the Philadelphia newspaper was exactly what she'd predicted. 4 sentences noting that she'd been a teacher and the widow of Reverend William Douglas, with no mention of her pioneering work in education, her medical practice, her role in the abolitionist movement, her innovations in pedagogy, her friendships with the giants of her age. She was buried in a modest grave in Philadelphia's Eden Cemetery. Within a generation, even people who, deep in her students, had forgotten the full extent of her accomplishments, remembered her only as a good teacher without understanding that she'd been revolutionary. The trunk full of photographs and letters that would eventually be discovered in 2019 had belonged to Sarah's niece, who'd preserved them carefully but hadn't known what to do with them. She'd understood that they were important, that they documented something significant, but she hadn't been able to get historians or archives interested in them. Papers of a colored schoolteacher wasn't considered historically valuable in the early 20th century, so the trunk had been stored in an attic, passed down through generations who knew it contained family history but didn't realize they were preserving evidence of one of the most remarkable lives in 19th century America. When the trunk was finally discovered in 2019, historians were stunned. The photographs alone would have been significant. Images of Sarah with Frederick Douglass, with Sojourner Truth, with leaders of the abolitionist movement, all carefully labeled and dated. But the letters were even more extraordinary. They revealed a woman of stunning intellectual breadth and depth. Sarah had corresponded with scientists about botanical specimens she'd collected and studied. She'd debated political theory with senators and congressmen. She'd exchanged medical observations with physicians who treated her as a peer even though official institutions wouldn't recognize her credentials. She'd advised civil rights leaders on strategy and tactics. She'd mentored generations of young black women, encouraging them to pursue education and careers and to never accept anyone's assessment of their limitations. The letters also revealed the systematic nature of her erasure. Sarah had documented, over and over, instances where her work was attributed to others, where her ideas were stolen, where her contributions were minimized or forgotten. She'd kept copies of newspaper articles that misattributed her accomplishments, meeting minutes that edited out her role, published histories that erased her presence. It was clear that Sarah had known, even while she was alive, that history was erasing her, and she'd tried to fight it by preserving evidence, by documenting everything, by keeping meticulous records. But even that hadn't been enough to overcome the structural forces that made black women's accomplishments invisible to the historical record. Historians who studied the trunk's contents began the painstaking work of reconstructing Sarah's life and restoring her to her rightful place in American history. They discovered that she'd been far more influential than even the photographs suggested. She'd pioneered teaching methods that were later adopted by progressive educators and credited to white reformers. She'd developed approaches to medical care for women and children that were revolutionary for their time. She'd been one of the first people to argue that education should be tailored to individual students' needs and learning styles rather than being one-size-fits-all, an idea that wouldn't become mainstream educational theory for another century. She'd trained teachers who'd gone on to establish schools across the country, creating a network of black-led educational institutions that laid the groundwork for post-Civil War advancement. She'd influenced Frederick Douglass's thinking about the importance of education for achieving racial equality. She'd advised Harriet Tubman on establishing schools for formerly enslaved people. She'd been a crucial bridge between the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement, working to ensure that black women's voices were included in both. All of this had been forgotten, erased, treated as historically insignificant. Why? The historians who studied Sarah's life identified several overlapping factors. First, she was black in a country that has consistently devalued and erased black contributions to American history. Second, she was a woman in an era when women's accomplishments were routinely attributed to men or dismissed as insignificant. Third, she worked primarily in fields, education and medicine, that were undervalued when practiced by women, especially black women. Fourth, she never wrote an autobiography or public memoir, and the people who might have written her biography in the decades after her death were themselves marginalized and lacked access to mainstream publishing. But perhaps most significantly, Sarah's erasure was convenient for the story America wanted to tell about itself. Acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging that black women had been intellectual and political leaders, that they'd built institutions and movements, that they'd been agents of their own liberation rather than passive victims waiting to be freed by benevolent whites. It would have complicated the narrative of progress, would have forced recognition that the great men of American history had often been building on foundations laid by people like Sarah, people whose work had been deliberately forgotten to make the great men seem more impressive. The rediscovery of Sarah's story in 2019 sparked a broader conversation about historical erasure and whose stories get told. Academic conferences were held about her life and work. Schools were named after her. Her teaching methods were studied and found to be remarkably progressive and effective. Medical historians recognized her as one of the first Black women to practice medicine in America, albeit without official credentials. But perhaps most importantly, historians began using Sarah's case as a template for finding other erased figures. If someone as accomplished and well-connected as Sarah Mapps Douglas could be almost completely forgotten, how many other remarkable lives had been erased from history? The answer, it turned out, was thousands, using the same techniques that had uncovered Sarah's story. Searching through private collections, examining photographs and letters, looking for marginalized voices in the papers of famous figures, historians began finding evidence of other Black women, Native American activists, working-class immigrants, disabled reformers, LGBTQ pioneers who'd been systematically written out of American history. Each discovery reinforced what Sarah herself had understood, that history isn't a neutral record of what happened, but a curated narrative shaped by power. The people who write history decide whose stories matter, and for most of American history, the people writing history were white men who decided that people like Sarah didn't matter enough to remember. What Sarah taught us. In 2021, the city of Philadelphia erected a monument to Sarah Mapps Douglas in the neighborhood where her school had once stood. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, descendants of her students, historians who'd helped uncover her story, educators who'd been inspired by her teaching methods, medical professionals who recognized her as a pioneer. One of Sarah's great-great-great-grandnieces spoke at the ceremony, reading from one of Sarah's letters. "I do not work for recognition. I work because the work needs to be done, because children need to be educated, because sick people need healing, because injustice needs to be fought. If I am forgotten, so be it. The lives I've touched will touch other lives, and the ripples of my work will continue long after my name has been lost. That is enough. That has to be enough. But it isn't enough. It shouldn't be enough." Sarah Mapps Douglas deserved to be remembered not just for her individual accomplishments, though those were extraordinary, but because her erasure represents a systematic historical injustice. She was forgotten not by accident but by design, written out of history because her existence complicated narratives about race and gender and power that America wasn't ready to challenge. Her story teaches us several crucial lessons. First, that excellence isn't enough to guarantee recognition. Sarah was brilliant, accomplished, innovative, and influential, but none of that protected her from being erased because she existed in a body that society had decided didn't deserve remembrance. Second, that historical narratives are always curated and always political. The decision to forget Sarah wasn't neutral. It was an active choice made by people who controlled the historical record, people who decided that some lives mattered more than others. Third, that erasure compounds over time. The longer Sarah was forgotten, the harder it became to recover her story. If that trunk hadn't been discovered, if someone hadn't recognized its significance, she might have been lost forever. And with her, the evidence of what was possible, what had been achieved, what had been stolen from history. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, that recovery is possible. Sarah's story was rediscovered because people committed to searching for marginalized voices, refused to accept that the historical record as written was complete or accurate, and did the painstaking work of reconstruction. The same can be done for countless other erased figures. History isn't static. It's constantly being revised as new evidence emerges and as we ask new questions about whose stories matter. Sarah Mapps Douglas was loved by many in her lifetime. She was respected, admired, influential, essential to the movements and institutions that shaped 19th century America. Then history erased her, not because she didn't matter, but because admitting that she mattered would have required America to confront uncomfortable truths about who had really built this nation and who had been denied credit for the building. But erasure isn't permanent. Truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried for generations. Sarah's photographs survived. Her letters survived. Her impact survived in the lives she'd touched and the institutions she'd built, even when her name was forgotten. And now, finally, her story is being told. She was loved by many. Then history erased her, but we're writing her back in, restoring her to her rightful place, acknowledging that she mattered then and matters now. Because her story isn't just about one remarkable woman who was forgotten. It's about all the remarkable people who've been systematically erased from history because their existence challenged power, complicated narratives, or simply didn't fit the story that America wanted to tell about itself. Every time we recover one of these lost stories, we come closer to understanding what actually happened, who actually built this country, whose labor and genius and sacrifice made possible the progress we claim to celebrate. Sarah Mapps Douglas taught children, healed the sick, fought for justice, and lived a life that changed the world in ways both visible and invisible. She did it knowing she probably wouldn't be remembered. She did it anyway. That's not tragedy, that's heroism. And now, finally, we're remembering. She was loved by many. Then history erased her. But truth doesn't burn. It doesn't disappear. It just waits, patient and persistent, for someone to care enough to look for it. We looked, we found her, and we won't let her be erased again. That's the promise we make to Sarah and to all the others whose stories have been buried. We will remember. We will tell your truth. We will make sure that excellence in marginalized bodies is no longer treated as expendable, forgettable, unworthy of preservation. Your stories matter. You mattered. You matter still. History tried to erase you, but we're writing you back in, with permanent ink this time, in letters that won't fade, in monuments that won't rumble, in memories that will be passed down and protected and honored. You were loved by many, and now, finally, you'll be remembered by all.